Hi everybody, it's Michael Wagner here again on the Family Wealth. Joe Lonsdale, many things, but also 8VC. So it's great to see you. Thank you for continuing this conversation.
Thank you.
I'm really enjoying it. So we've been talking about a number of topics. What I want to talk about in this segment is really this intersection of business and philanthropy and how we solve problems, right? So I know you're active in that space. How are you using your business and entrepreneurial background to be a better philanthropist and opportunities there? Very broad, open sort of question.
No, I love this topic. So 8VC, our firm, is a for-profit venture capital firm. I tend to think that the very best venture investments, like we were talking about, they're solving problems. They're fixing things that are broken, right? You're taking, frankly, some of the brightest people in our society who are working harder than almost anyone else, right? These startups are really intense. Like, people work like crazy, and you gotta get the best people, and then you're doing something very hard, which is to create a new and better way of industry working. And you're trying to fill gaps in the world that you're seeing. And as someone who we're constantly trying to study what are the big gaps in the world, what really matters, like, not all of those gaps can be solved by entrepreneurship. I tend to be on the side that entrepreneurship could solve like way more than people realize, but it's like not everything should be entrepreneurship. So there's a lot of other examples of things where you want to do it either philanthropically or really philanthropically with policy, because a lot of things are broken because we've accidentally, as a society, maybe set up the wrong way for that industry to work with the rules.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of times you'll see a better way the industry should work, but the big companies running the industry, they've put in rules that stop that. That's just very, very common.
Yeah.
As an example of philanthropy, one of the things I've been passionate about the last 10 years using technology is I'm good friends with Ashton Kutcher, who's the actor, and he's an investor in tech. And I got to know him a decade ago, and I helped him put together a group called Thorn, which I was an early board member and backer of. And what we did is we would go and we'd have a technology that automatically searched the dark web, which is like all these different random parts of the web where people hang out and oftentimes do nefarious things. And we'd search for any kind of child abuse images. And we'd automatically have the computer identify it, because AI could do this now, another good use of AI, and it would send it to a group called the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC, which Palantir philanthropically helps as well. And so it would go to them, and if it was a new image, it would hash it against all their millions of horrible images. And if it's a new one, that suggests that there might be a child in danger, because it might be someone had put up recently. So if it's a new one, we'd trace it back, we'd help get a warrant to go after the ISP, the service provider, and then wherever it was in the world. And they would very often get the warrant, and people would go there and very often go rescue a kid who's being abused. And so you search for, you try to find out who the kid is, you try to save him. And so actually we've ended up saving several thousand kids over the last decade who are being abused by being able to find, search these places, which is like a pretty cool mission, right? And that's something that, I'm sure if we really wanted to, you could have made a business out of it, but it just seems like such a good thing to do philanthropically. So that's how we structured it. And I think that, Thorn's a great philanthropic group still going. People donate to it. You're saving kids. It's really neat. And so that's an example of one where it's innovation and technology, but why not make it nonprofit? And we try to make it sustainable by selling some of the tools to governments, but it's a nonprofit org. In other nonprofit things I do, I tend to like to try to see how do we fix the rules for this industry to be more fair and open for everyone. I'll give you a couple examples of those that are fun. One of them I really like is, in this case, just getting results, is the vocational schools in a lot of states underperform. I think vocational school is a great way to help kids who maybe, four-year college is not right for everyone. There's about 6 million jobs in the US right now that are highly skilled jobs that we're in need of, whether it's an electrician, whether it's a plumber, whether it's like a high-end maintenance worker, or manufacturing workers, biological manufacturing workers. There's gaps. We need people. Right. And so vocational schools should be filling these, and they're not. So in Texas 7 years ago, they passed a rule through our friends that said that vocational schools, which are funded by the state, will only receive funding in proportion to the salaries of their students coming out. And at first, this is very controversial, but if you think about it, that's kind of the job of a vocational school, is you're training them to come and get out, get a good salary. Right. And they looked at the 3-year salaries coming out, and they used it to do the formula. And so these schools said, oh wow, we have to all of a sudden teach skills that matter. We have to focus on that, and we have to partner with businesses, and we have to figure out how we can get our graduates hired well. And guess what? Over these 7 years, salaries were up 117% out of these schools, right? Incentives actually matter. Yeah. Incentives work. So for me, what we're doing is we're taking the values of our free society and the functional parts of our free society, and we're putting those same incentives, the same accountability into broken areas. So just like entrepreneurs can go and fix a broken area, I think a policy entrepreneur can philanthropically go and fix these areas that help lots of people. So that's an example now that our group Cicero Institute's taking that to lots of other states and putting that incentive in to help things. I'll tell you, Florida is the easiest one to work with. I love Florida. Yeah. The legislature here is very pro-innovation. It's very quick to kind of respond to these ideas. There's a big kind of sense that it's their duty to push back on special interests here. You don't really get that in every state. I'm being totally honest about that. I think the governor's very responsive to that. Chris Sproul as a speaker has been great to work with in the legislature here in Florida. So we have some groups in Tallahassee we work with and get things done. So we're in about 10 states, and I think the whole world kind of should be kind of looking at what's going on in Texas and Florida, because economists have something called revealed preference. And it's pretty clear the revealed preference based on where everyone's going is that Texas and Florida are doing some things right.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I appreciate you saying that. I know you've been spending a little more time, certainly in Texas, but also in Florida.
Definitely.
And I'm curious, it feels to me, and I wonder if you agree with this, you mentioned that we work in these S-curves.
Yeah.
Do you feel we're on an upward part of the S-curve, or we're coming up onto one of those plateaus? I get the sense that we may be at an inflection point. Please feel free to disagree with me. Where do you think we're at in that graph?
Yeah, because it applies obviously to lots of different
Sure.
types of areas. Originally, I was talking about it, of course, in terms of the advancement of artificial intelligence, which would be a different curve than we're on at this one. I think if you're talking about the economy or the functionality of our government,
and the idea of using business, this idea of almost like impact investing in a way, which is not exactly what we're talking about, but
I think we are. I think we are at a really important point in having that conversation. I think there's a lot of naivety and bad judgment that goes into that conversation, because the conversation, on the one hand, like there's different extremes that are both kind of wrong, right? So on the one hand, you have an extreme that like business is bad and it's hurting the world and capitalism's not going to work anymore, so therefore we need to make it impact investing. And I think that's not really right. I think a lot of the ways I've made the most money and outperformed other funds is by doing things that are impactful and positive. Right. So I don't think that criticism of business is entirely right.
Sure.
Although there's things to improve. I'm not an extremist. It's like where like the market's perfect and everything the market does is going to be great. I think having a culture where we all value positive impact and we all stop and say, okay, if we're making this investment, if we're working on this, to hire the best people, in the venture world right now, whether as investors or building a company, they have to believe this is something that is contributing to society in a really positive way. They have to, even if it's a little bit complicated, they have to say, okay, yeah, if we solve this problem, it's creating wealth for everyone. It's not, we're not doing something to secretly damage the environment. You're not doing something that takes advantage of people. And so I think that is really positive in our culture. I would probably like to shift some of the way institutions approach this, just because you see a lot of people, including Elon Musk and Mark Andreessen, kind of mocking ESG online recently, just because it's like not really clear what ESG means. I mean, is it ESG if I build that non-lethal defense company to protect someone? Is it ESG if we do natural gas, which is the thing that's brought down emissions the most the last 20 years in the world, which is really good, or is it not because it's not renewable, or, so there's I think it's a little bit silly having these kind of like top-down structures, but I do think we're at a point where we're trying to understand how culture really wants to be good, wants to be positive. I think businesses want to make sure they're playing a good role, and I think that's great right now.
These very strict labels may be helpful in some sense, but harmful in others.
You got to be really careful of anything in society, just like we were talking about earlier with like how the vocational schools are run by the government, or how how prisons are run right now top down. If you have things run top down, they tend to get really broken, right? It's like the whole Soviet versus American argument, right? I think the American argument, one, is that you don't want to run everything top down. You want to have a competition of ideas. You want to constantly have a dynamic world where you're trying new things and the best ideas are winning. So you got to be really careful putting in frameworks that are too top down, they're too rigid. But I think the idea of a framework, if it's really flexible and it's dynamic and it allows for different ideas about what's right, I think that's great.
Right. So Joe, you've got a podcast, The American Optimist. I've got to ask, what are we most optimistic about? What really excites you as you look forward?
Well, I'm still most optimistic on America, first of all. Of course, America is still the place, I think, where you have the best chance of creating prosperity, and it still has the values most aligned, with what I believe makes things work in the world. There's definitely challenges here. There's definitely things to fix. But America is definitely set in a really strong position right now. I think one of the most important things from like a general perspective is what's the standard of living and the experience of the working class, the middle class in America. And there's so many new things that should make that cost go way down. There's so many ways in which like people should be living so much better than they were 20, 30, 40 years ago. And there's things we've done policy-wise that kind of break it, right? So like there's all sorts of problems with zoning. There's all sorts of problems with how we handle infrastructure, and people shouldn't ever have to be in traffic again with the way we can build tunnels cheaply with Elon now. Like people shouldn't ever have to pay as much as they pay for houses right now because there's just so much relative room for people in America with where it is. So there's all these ways in which it's not hard at all to improve everyone's life a lot. And then there's just huge advances going on. I think biology is one of the most interesting. We understand now a lot of the fundamental ways in which aging works, and in which aging is constructed, and in which we've proven with the Nobel Prize Yamanaka factors that you could turn cells back to age 0. There's tens of billions of dollars and lots of great scientists going in and showing how all these diseases actually could be understood based on how they relate to aging and how we can turn that around and fix these disease pathways. And there's just a major revolution going on in biology and how we're curing cancer, how we're curing how we're understanding Alzheimer's. If we don't break things, like the amount of disease that's going to get cured the next 10 or 20 years is extraordinary.
Right. It's certainly a lot to be optimistic and look forward to. I'm wondering if this is an interesting one. What can any of us do individually to help move that ball forward? Are there enough entrepreneurial people with a philanthropic bent out there? What can we do to sort of?
Yeah, well, I think good policy. I think good policy matters, and I think that supporting people who supporting people who believe in a society that's free and that works bottom up, that doesn't have people top down ruining things. I think that's really important. I think each of us, I'm starting the University of Austin because I want a place that trains courageous, smart intellectual leaders who can think for themselves versus being pushed into groupthink. I think we hopefully can influence other top universities that way. I think training our kids to be interested in entrepreneurship and to be interested in science, to be substantive people, and these are all things that push things forward.
Right, going back to first principles, the critical thinking skills, and really doing what we can on an individual basis to.
And there's philanthropies too. Like I'll give you another one. Like Damon Runyon, I think is really cool, where they take the people who won the Nobel Prizes and won the big awards in the last generation, and those people help choose the new top young people to give extra money to. And it's unfortunate the way the NIH works with the government right now is it's only mostly funding much older people these days. It's very risk averse. So most breakthroughs tend to be made by people on average at least who are a little bit younger. And these are only given to people who are already kind of known, already have big giant labs, and I think it's a very poor use of money relative to what it could be. So I think there's some philanthropies like Damon Runyon have been around for decades that have about 100x better results for the dollars into people they're doing. So there's things like that we like to support as well.
Sure. Well, thank you for sharing that. Joe, I want to thank you. This has been a great conversation. Enjoyed every moment of it. I hope you have as well. It's been a pleasure. So thank you. I want to thank everybody for their time and attention. We'll be back soon. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Thanks, Joe. It was a pleasure.